Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, Nilanthi, all the way there in Washington, and to everyone else who's joining us from different capitals, different parts of the world, and also of Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for coming on board for what is our second Awarelogue lecture forum. This lecture forum is going to focus on a very contemporary topic, something that is very much in the news, something that is being discussed very widely across the world, not just in one part of it, or not only in Sri Lanka, but is a matter of concern, a matter of interest, a matter of intrigue, sometimes even a matter of worry. And that's because we need to know more. We are very concerned about what issues are, and we need to be that much more informed. And that is where this platform of the Awarelogue initiative talks about the promotion of awareness and, of course, engaging in dialogue. So in keeping with tradition, we will be introducing our guest speaker who's taken time to join us all the way from Washington. And thereafter, we will be hearing from her, and we will be moving thereafter into a time of questions and answers. You're invited to type your questions into the chat box. You can start doing it without waiting until the end. You can start doing it as soon as a question arises, or a query or a concern you want to express something. You can always do that. We request that you keep your mics off. We've had experiences where this has interfered sometimes with the speaking. Let's start. So it's indeed an extreme honor to welcome someone who I have had a lot of respect for, a researcher who's done marvelous work in this particular field. Nilanthi Samaranayake needs no introduction into this particular area of study in talking about the Indo-Pacific. She heads the Strategy and Policy Analysis program at the Center for Naval Analyses in the United States, where she has been working for over a decade now. Before that, she was with the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. She has led several studies on Indian Ocean strategy, including US-India naval relations. She also provides analytical support to civilian and military leaders on US alliances and strategic partnerships, as well as contested sovereignty, US basing rights, the development of regional, trans-regional strategies, non-traditional security issues, as well as small states in an era of great power competition. And I think there's no one more suitable to speak to us on this topic today. Having earned her MSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science, we're very, very honored to have you with us today, Nilanthi. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. And it's over to you. We're going to be speaking about the Indo-Pacific concept and the impact on Sri Lanka. Nilanthi, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and also for the invitation to be here and share views from my personal research. I was asked to speak about the Indo-Pacific concept and its impact on Sri Lanka. And I'm speaking from Washington and will provide an American perspective on the topic. So I look forward to hearing other regional views during the discussion portion today. I have 3 points that I want to make. So first, I'll just hit this continue button. Okay. For my first point, from my perspective, Washington has been evolving in its articulation of US interests in this region for over the past decade, to the point where now US policy characterizes the region as being the Indo-Pacific. And I see this shift as being traced to India's increased importance in US strategy and the US being influenced by Japan and Australia's thought leadership on the Indo-Pacific concept. Second, while this has been a notable change, my view is that US interests will remain firmly entrenched in the Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific, with the primacy of effort here and secondary attention to the Indian Ocean. And then finally, since we're talking about Sri Lanka, this US emphasis on the Pacific in the Indo-Pacific concept that may ultimately prove to be a source of continuity for Indian Ocean countries like Sri Lanka that are concerned about great power competition in their region. Sri Lanka is a small state, and it will continue to do what it's always done, which is navigate the larger powers in the region, but most importantly, India to the north, which is the dominant country in South Asia. Excuse me. So to start, For decades, the United States has characterized its strategic interest in Asia as being the Asia-Pacific. And this can be attributed to the fact that the US has territory in the Pacific Ocean, plus it has historical interests dating back to over a century in continental Asia. It has military basing and access needs, and also significant economic interests in the Pacific. So it was interesting to see about a decade ago, parts of the US government looked to be experimenting with the new articulation of US regional interests as extending beyond the Asia Pacific. In 2012, the State Department began referring to the development of an Indo-Pacific economic corridor to connect South Asia and Southeast Asia. Then the following year, the US Pacific Commander, Admiral Locklear, he began referring to this region as the Indo-Asia Pacific to characterize US interests in his area of responsibility. This development finally acknowledged the fact that this area of responsibility had long included the Indian Ocean, but I think it also reflected an ongoing US effort to emphasize the growing importance of India to US strategic interests, which had already been about a decade old at that point. Now, following this move coming from US Pacific Command, or PACOM, the US Naval Services also adopted this conceptualization of the region as the Indo-Asia Pacific in their own 2015 strategy document, A Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power. But this was still an evolutionary process. It wasn't streamlined thinking, because that same year, the Pentagon, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, released a maritime strategy document that had Asia Pacific in the title. So it was really still not yet completely streamlined. But then you move to the Trump administration, and the Indo-Pacific phrase entered US government documents in a synchronized way, starting with the National Security Strategy in 2017. The document discussed the importance of this region to US national interests. And interestingly, it also had a normative goal to keep the region free and open. And the Indo-Pacific phrase, that's also referenced in the National Defense Strategy summary document from the following year. Also that year, US Pacific Command, or PACOM, was renamed Indo-Pacific Command, or Indo-PACOM, thereby further synchronizing this characterization of US policy in the region. And then the following year, the US State Department put out its report, A Free and Open Indo-Pacific, Advancing a Shared Vision, which discussed Washington's efforts to work with its allies and partners toward this normative goal for the region. Also that year, the Pentagon released its own Indo-Pacific strategy report that detailed the Defense Department's efforts with countries in the region. And then this thinking has also continued into the Biden administration, which earlier this year put out its interim national security strategic guidance and also discussed the Indo-Pacific. And President Biden himself has used the phrase free and open Indo-Pacific in the Quad Summit that we saw in March with the leaders of Japan, India, and Australia. So I think it's important to reflect this important evolution in how US policymakers think about the region and articulate US national interests in this region. My second point is that despite these changes in US policy thinking, there still has been a fundamental baseline continuity that US interests continue to remain firmly in the Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific, with priority here and secondary attention to the Indian Ocean. It's important to acknowledge the changes, though, the addition of the Indo term to the Indo-Pacific. Also, the reference to continental Asia has been dropped from Asia Pacific. Certainly, US interests will continue on land, but the adoption of this primarily maritime conception of the region, Indo-Pacific, is striking in a US national security document. Also, the name change of the longstanding Pacific Command, or PACOM, which is a joint military command, to this maritime conception of the area of responsibility, Indo-PACOM, is also striking. And it suggests perhaps that the US Navy may assume an increased importance in US defense policy, whereas US ground forces have arguably attracted more attention among US policymakers and defense planners historically. Now, despite this broader focus on the maritime domain and India and the Indian Ocean, I think there's been a continuity still in this path toward this Indo-Pacific concept. US priorities and planning remain mostly the same as before. For example, while PACOM was renamed Indo-PACOM, the geographic responsibilities for this command have not changed. It continues to exclude the western part of the Indian Ocean. And this is in alignment with the 2017 National Security Strategy, which defines the scope of the Indo-Pacific as stretching from the west coast of India to the western shores of the United States. Also, many US policy documents state that the US is a Pacific nation, and you can see that in the Department of Defense's Indo-Pacific Strategy Report. So I think one indicator could be, until a policy level change realigns military planning responsibilities, the Pacific will remain the priority for the United States, despite this shift to the Indo-Pacific articulation of US strategic interests. Also, there's been increased US concern about stability in the South China Sea and China's maritime claims and island building and overall militarization of the region. The Trump administration placed emphasis on China's challenge to the wider rules-based international order. And it took the step in last July of aligning US government policy with the 2016 international arbitration ruling on the China-Philippines maritime dispute in the South China Sea. And so fast forward a year later, the Biden administration upheld this stance earlier this month, so continuing to reject China's excessive maritime claims. And then also the previous administration actively called for the US to increase its quadrilateral cooperation with India, Japan, and Australia, especially in the context of China's assertive activities. This was seen in the 2017 National Security Strategy and also the subsequent heavy push by the administration in terms of diplomacy with these countries. And I think the results are, you can see the US use of this term has really converged with its allies, Japan and Australia, who had been thought leaders really in terms of developing this Indo-Pacific concept dating back to the mid-2000s. And then for India's part and its path toward this Quad cooperation, China's assertiveness along their land border and against Bhutan in 2017 that has really magnified India's threat perceptions and deepened its willingness to participate in the Quad. So you have all four countries are now actively engaging in Quad consultations. The Biden administration has continued this Quad effort, seen most recently at the Quad Leaders Summit meeting in March. And also as recently as November, there was a Malabar exercise with all four countries, which had not been seen since 2007. And then third, to close with the Indo-Pacific concept and its impact on Sri Lanka, if we're talking about Sri Lanka, this US emphasis on the Pacific in the Indo-Pacific, that may ultimately prove to be a source of continuity for Indian Ocean countries like Sri Lanka that are concerned about great power competition in their region. Washington will continue to demonstrate its active interest in the security of the Indo-Pacific region through Quad. It'll continue to do its freedom of navigation military operations as part of a larger US national policy. And it'll conduct maritime capacity building efforts with countries like Sri Lanka. And then thinking about Sri Lanka in particular, it's a small state. So I see this as really a reversion to the norm, where Sri Lanka has always needed to navigate the larger powers in the region. You've seen this with the 1971 Indian Ocean Zone of Peace proposal, or in the 1980s with tensions with India over Sri Lanka's ties with the United States. So it's really a timeless issue for Sri Lanka. And then I think recently, India's threat perceptions have been heightened by China in the past 2 years at the border, to include even the deaths of Indian soldiers. So Sri Lanka, as a small state, needs to navigate this complex climate. So it's really nothing new for Sri Lanka. It's very familiar to what happened during the Cold War. But interestingly, there is a different extra-regional power of concern. It was the United States then, but now China is that extra-regional power that is causing consternation in India. So I'll pause here, and I look forward to hearing other views about the impacts on Sri Lanka in this larger climate.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nilanthi, for those three main areas that you focused on. We invite everyone to start sending in your questions. You can put them in the chat box, and we will moderate them, and they'll be fielded to Nilanthi. Nilanthi, if I were to just take you back to a point that you raised, and you were talking about how the main characters have now changed, dynamics have changed. 1971, that period was very different with the height of the Cold War. We come to the 80s, the Cold War is still very much around, but of course things have changed because now Afghanistan has come into the equation. The Soviet Union is in Afghanistan. There was a different dynamic going on over there. If you look at the current context, and you mentioned China, and we can't not talk about China and we talk about the Indo-Pacific concept there. At the end of the day, all four Quad members are working very closely with this country in terms of trade, in terms of commerce. How does this play out? So there's this competition, cooperation, correlation that's going on. And as you said, this is not something new for Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has had to contend with these issues for quite some time, maybe with different main protagonists on the stage. But in this situation, how did Sri Lanka kind of wade her way through this scenario where you have these countries? China has the largest amount of bombs in America. You have China working very closely with countries like Australia as well, and of course with India too. How does this play out?
Well, it's an interesting situation that you bring up, because China is very different from the Soviet Union, for example, when you consider its economic engagement and integration in the wider global economy. So it's very hard to isolate China as was done with or attempted to do with the Soviet Union, and really try to divide the world into a bipolar framework, because it's just you can't do that, because China is too heavily integrated in terms of relating with all these economies, including the United States. So it's a bit different in that sense, but I think still fundamentally, though, if we're talking about Sri Lanka's strategy, it can't afford to alienate any of these countries. The United States, China, India. It needs to really. I think it derives from the fact it's a small state, that it just doesn't have the capability to reject working with these countries. So and I think Sri Lanka really it's still developing, middle income country. At least according to the World Bank, lower middle income. It still has national development goals that it's trying to meet. So I think it's really not in its interest to only pick, the United States, or only pick China, or only,
Sri Lanka is not in a position to work with just one. I mean, given the fact that the country is small, and the country has history with all of these countries, you've got to look at the larger picture in terms of how that interaction takes place. So Charita is in the process of typing in a question. Okay, so Shantini has sent in a question. Do you see the Colombo Port City project with heavy Chinese presence as something pitted against the US Indo-Pacific strategy? In Washington, are you getting that feel?
I think it is framed that way, certainly. My personal opinion, I do not see it as pitted against the US Indo-Pacific strategy. I see it as an economic project. I see it as a project that brings a lot of foreign direct investment into Sri Lanka, a much needed source of gaining foreign exchange reserves, where Sri Lanka is in a very, very difficult time with regard to that position. So I think there is certainly that framing, though, that at least at the geopolitical level, that this is anti the United States or anti a particular country. But I think it's important to think about the different dimensions of international relations as Sri Lanka needs to interact with China or the US or India.
If you were to just reflect on the role of Afghanistan in the current context, do you see, now we go back to 1979, Nilanthi, and this is a concern that has come up quite often now. In 1979, we had a different situation where the Soviet Union gets involved, the Taliban is playing a big role there, and we saw what happened thereafter. The Cold War actually comes into South Asia. With the US now pulling out of Afghanistan, what kind of impact is that going to have on the Indo-Pacific concept, on the Quad? How are they going to react to the situation that is unfolding in Afghanistan? Because things are not looking very rosy, let's put it lightly.
It's a good question. I think that there are maybe perhaps certain limits to that, at least Cold War comparison with regard to Afghanistan and what the Soviet Union was attempting to get out of Afghanistan and the invasion in '79. But I see really the US withdrawal, that's really looking west and in the US Central Command area of responsibility. But the US has signaled certainly greater interest in the Indo-Pacific region, and is really in terms of, there's talk that the US, at least in the last administration, is interested in establishing an embassy in Maldives, for example. That was a very notable development. It'll be interesting to see whether the current administration will be able to execute that goal from the previous administration. But I think really looking eastward, there's been a lot of signaling of the US's interest in the entire region. So I think Afghanistan, that reflects more of a legacy issue of the last 20 years, whereas I see the focus on the Indo-Pacific to the east, that's really reflecting an interest in going forward in terms of rising US national interests.
So Charita's question has come through. Do you think Indian efforts in terms of boosting naval capacity, port infrastructure, and partnerships in the Indian Ocean region can balance Chinese influence in this part of the region?
Well, I think it depends on what you mean in terms of balance, but I think if you're talking about demonstrating India's commitment and its capability to having a presence in the wider Indian Ocean region, I think it's certainly achieving that, because you can really see a concerted policy coming out of New Delhi in terms of building up India's naval capability, improving its maritime domain awareness across the Indian Ocean, improving its naval diplomacy efforts as far out as Seychelles and just in all the corners of the Indian Ocean. Also, its mission-based deployments program, where the Indian Navy is 24/7 operating in certain areas of the Indian Ocean. So I think taken together, that certainly speaks to the comparative position between India and China in that scenario is certainly clear. But I think this question of balancing, I think we need to think about what does that actually mean, like at sea, at the tactical level. What does that mean?
So a question is coming from Yasuranga, who says, what are the direct and indirect benefits to Sri Lanka and to the Sri Lankan Navy in particular in playing a bigger role in the Indo-Pacific region? I guess the understanding there is getting more involved with efforts in this part of the world.
That's an interesting question. Certainly, the U.S. is declaring the Indo-Pacific. It's more of a focus for certainly in terms of U.S. officials and their statements. And thinking about Sri Lanka's position, from my observation, I think Sri Lanka is a country that can benefit from more maritime capacity building. So your question also refers to the Sri Lankan Navy. So that potentially could be an area, if you're asking about benefits to the Navy, just in terms of the ability to have a greater awareness of what is the activity that's going on in the exclusive economic zone. That type of heightened awareness would be important. Also in terms of like Coast Guard cutters, the Sri Lanka Navy has received 2 of those from the United States in the recent years. So I think those types of activities, those are tangible demonstrations of U.S. interests and implementing the Indo-Pacific strategy.
So this question, I guess, I don't know how you're going to answer this, but with the reclaim of land near the Colombo port area, delimitation of territorial sea, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, would these extend that much further or remain the same? The fact that we now have more territory, in your understanding, Nilanthi, do you think we're going to get more of an exclusive economic zone, or does it remain the same? I guess this is very much...
yeah, that's a very good question. I don't have the answer to that. Sorry, it's an interesting question though.
That's a technical point coming in there. In terms of countries in the region working with, so the question is, when we look at the countries in South Asia and their participation in the Indo-Pacific, how much of cooperation have you seen from other countries? I guess this is from a South Asian perspective.
So can you repeat the question?
Yes. From a South Asian perspective, when you look at the other countries in South Asia, how much of cooperation, I guess also involvement, have you seen from these countries in the Indo-Pacific concept?
So from a South, so you're talking about like Nepal?
Let's say Nepal, Bangladesh, we're also going to the other, let's say the Maldives. We might even go towards the border of ASEAN, let's say Myanmar.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's certainly a U.S. initiative, so it's hard to. I guess it's not really fair to expect the countries in the region to engage with a concept, or at least an effort or strategic effort that's coming out of the U.S. But I think in terms of just not signaling an outright aversion to U.S. policy, I think that would be a desired outcome of the Indo-Pacific strategy at a minimum. But I think it's, at least from a U.S. perspective, if you're thinking about the strategy, I don't know if that's necessarily a fair expectation to expect like Nepal or right, even going out as far into ASEAN to necessarily engage with a U.S. strategy on U.S. terms. But yeah, just in terms of the status quo right now, as Singapore is an important location for the U.S. in terms of military access, I think that is something that is just an obvious priority in the U.S. Pacific, the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So maintaining those types of important relationships in Southeast Asia are really critical from a U.S. policy perspective.
How much of an impact do you think the coronavirus has had in the domestic politics of Asian states, such as the slide towards what is sometimes termed authoritarianism and quasi-dictatorships in certain countries? Furthermore, how much of an impact do you think China has in this trend? And what is your respected opinion on US actions and its constraints on the said trend?
That's an excellent question. It's really a very thoughtful question. I think the coronavirus has really hit these countries very hard. I mean, that's obvious in terms of the number of cases, but when you think about these countries in terms of their positions as lower middle income economies, and the national development goals that they're all trying to meet, and then also in terms of some countries like Sri Lanka or Maldives that have very high debt to GDP ratios and the impacts on key industries like tourism and the ability to bring in foreign income and the difficulties associated with paying back some of those debts due to lacking foreign exchange reserves. I think that in addition to the social toll that the pandemic has taken on each of these countries, there are just significant economic impacts for the countries that I think these leaders at the political level it's kind of gotten away from these leaders. It's been very difficult just given the developing economic context of these countries to begin with. But in terms of your question about authoritarianism and quasi-dictatorships, it's a good one, because it's when you have these difficult economic situations and exacerbated certainly by the human toll that the pandemic has taken. I think from these countries' perspectives, it's been concerning to see some of the effects in terms of democracy and respect for media freedoms. Yeah, I think they're all having multiple second order effects.
So Hashan asked this question. I would love to know your opinion on how Sri Lanka can improve through geological landforms, such as the growth of seamounts. For example, and he talks about Afanasy-Nikitin seamount and its relationship in this context.
Oh, I'm not familiar with those seamounts, so I'd be curious to know more what that's about.
I guess he's talking about this Russian merchant, and we're going back to the 1400s. Afanasy-Nikitin was someone who traveled to this part of the world. He was mainly in India. And he talked about his journeys beyond 3 seas and areas such as that. I guess when we look at the land mass of where we are, if I were to extend from what Hashan has also asked there, how can Sri Lanka make this work better? Sometimes we feel like we're caught between the two, but then we don't look at countries like Nepal, for example. And if you think Sri Lanka is in a tight spot, please look at Nepal. That's something that I like to always reflect on. You see, there's every challenge is an opportunity. How are we trying to leverage on that, or what can we do to leverage on that?
That's a really good question, George. I think it's important to think about, we're talking at different levels. So when you mentioned the concept of being caught between countries, we're thinking at the major powers or great powers level of the US or China or a major power or a regional power like India. So I think that's one level. But another is exactly what you mentioned. What about Sri Lanka's ties with Nepal or Sri Lanka's ties with Bangladesh? I've been thinking increasingly about the region as smaller South Asia or SSA. Essentially, these are countries that are smaller than India. Bangladesh certainly objectively has a very large, one of the largest populations in the world, but there is still an asymmetry of power and relationship when it comes to India. So I would include Bangladesh as a smaller South Asian country. I would include Nepal as that. So I think at that level, you're really talking about Sri Lanka's relations with fellow smaller South Asian countries or SSA countries. So I think that is certainly a dimension that is worth investing in and developing in. And I think Sri Lanka has done that to some extent, such as standing up the High Commission in Afghanistan, really trying to work to develop its relations with some of these regional level countries. So I think that's, it's something that I think gets missed because the relations between the smaller South Asian countries are perhaps not as much of interest as China's relations with X country or US relations with Y country. But it's certainly worth investing in, especially when you consider how lacking in integration South Asia is as a region in terms of economic development and how much more needs to be done.
Absolutely. There's so much of scope, so much of opportunity. It's just that sometimes we haven't tapped into the right areas, so we haven't taken measures in that direction. Nilanthi, how do you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, given that now there is overlapping membership? You have India as a part of the Quad. India is also now a full member of the SCO. What impact do you think this is going to have, or is it not being considered in Washington?
Yeah, we don't get a lot of discussion here about the SCO, but I think it is very interesting from a regional context. India's increased interest in SCO, Pakistan's increased interest in SCO, India certainly wanting to expand its regional reach, going beyond the smaller South Asian countries and thinking more about integration with Central Asia, certainly its relationship with Russia. That's a very interesting set of relationships as well. And I believe Sri Lanka is a dialogue partner with SCO. So that's kind of interesting to me as an observer looking at Sri Lanka's changing diplomatic relations as well, becoming a dialogue partner with a regional institution that is so focused on Central Asia and the continent.
Because I guess that's where the SCO, we became a dialogue partner back in 2009. We were actually the first dialogue partner to join up with this grouping. And this is where, when we talk about Asia, and we talk about, you exactly as you said, you focus a lot on Central Asia, but now you have India and Pakistan also. There's two very, very important players in this grouping. And very often we are told this is not a military alliance, don't look at it as such. President Putin has mentioned this on consecutive occasions, but of course, this is a grouping that is rising. It's very much under the radar. And as you said, even I think from a NATO perspective, NATO does not focus too much on the SCO, and it focuses on Russia. And I guess America also focuses on, let's say, China or Russia directly on a bilateral level, and is not probably looking at that multilateral aspect. And this is where overlapping members can actually have an impact there.
It is, yeah. Excuse me. From a U.S. perspective, it is interesting looking at the SCO because terrorism and counterterrorism is certainly a topic that is of interest to these countries. But you don't see the issue of democracy and those types of values really in SCO like you do in NATO, for example, as you mentioned. So it's interesting to think about what the rise of that regional architecture represents from a democratic promotion point of view.
Could there be some kind of the fact that you have India, Australia, Japan, and America coming together? As you mentioned, ideology. Are we going into another ideological divide? Are we going into that arena once again? And I guess that's what I wanted to connect up with the whole concept of China and the SCO. Are we entering another era of something similar, a new Cold War, or whatever you want to term it, where there's going to be an ideological divide as well?
Yeah, I think it would be unfortunate if that were to happen, because I think there's actually perhaps more commonality there than is often paid attention to. Just in terms of China, its ability to contribute to the public goods, I think you have seen that, at least in terms of its counter-piracy deployments to the Western Indian Ocean, being part of that multinational naval response, or China developing, conducting disaster relief for countries that have been affected by like floods in Sri Lanka, or like in Maldives in the water crisis. So I think the countries like China can certainly contribute to public goods, but it's the question of some of these really difficult issues like its claims in the South China Sea that are very problematic from a US standpoint. So the risk is, will that spread to other areas of activity and even previous cooperation? I think that's the risk. So I think I don't think the situation necessarily has to follow the Cold War in terms of it being an ideological battle.
Mm-hmm. So Amila asked the question, what do you think about climate change impact on small states in the Indo-Pacific and the possible influence on illegal immigrants? How would this feed into the Indo-Pacific?
That's an interesting, the second part of that is very interesting. I think climate change, certainly in terms of small island developing states, just as a grouping in the UN system, they are all very concerned about the impact of climate change. So I think Sri Lanka, Maldives, certainly in terms of its thought leadership on the issue of climate change, dating back to over a decade ago. It's certainly an issue that these countries need to work on. Maldives, in terms of constructing that seawall around Male, that's a very tangible way forward, but it's very costly, and those types of efforts are very hard to achieve, especially in the wider context of a region that really has lacking connectivity more generally. So then it becomes a matter of prioritization in terms of what these countries are going to focus on. But yeah, climate change, this issue of responding to this threat, it's not going away. So it's increasingly going to need to be factored into, at least in the Indian Ocean, developing countries' perspectives in terms of priorities. But I think also increasingly the countries like the US, the European countries like NATO, they are trying to think about how they can engage with this issue of climate change, because the countries in South Asia, they can't do it alone. And then of course there is this issue of responsibility in terms of the previous round of countries that were developing. So I think that you see that now in terms of NATO's and their climate change action plan, in terms of what their focus should be. So I think that is still, it's still an effort in progress though. But yeah, I think I agree with you, Amila, that this issue of climate change, it's certainly having a big impact, and the smaller states in the region need to address it.
Thanks. Charana has sent in a question saying, could the Indo-Pacific realignment with emphasis on India to support US interests in South Asia have a negative impact on Sri Lanka from a strategic security perspective, as US considers a strategic competitor and threat, and India as a strategic ally?
I don't know if it's phrasing of that question, but it sounded like part of it makes an assumption about India supporting the US. I don't know that's necessarily the case, or at least I wouldn't agree with that. I think India comes to this concept of the Quad and the Indo-Pacific on its own terms, on its own path, in terms of how it's cultivated its own Indian Ocean strategy, which has really been also a work in progress and evolution over the past decade, where it has really woken up to its own interests and awareness of its maritime related interests, because it had focused so much on really the continental aspect of its country and the land, and conflicts with Pakistan and Kashmir. It was so land centric, and Indian naval strategists have talked about India's sea blindness for many years. So really the past decade, you've seen this awakening in terms of Indian strategic thought, and then finally implementation on some of these policy goals. So I think that the US can't necessarily assume that India is supporting a US Indo-Pacific strategy, because India has come to this type of engagement on its own terms. And I would argue China has really been that key catalyst that has encouraged India to come, whereas I think the US had been trying for many years to really kind of bring India more into its fold as a strategic partner. But I think the question is also asking about the effects on some of the smaller states in the region. I think that's a separate issue, because India has it's a perennial issue, India's relations with its neighborhood. That's something that will exist regardless of US policy toward the Indo-Pacific. There's just a fundamental asymmetry of power in India's bilateral relationships with the smaller countries in the region. So the question is, to what extent is US Indo-Pacific strategy, will that complicate India's relations with its smaller neighbors? And some of that reflects US-India ties and their ability to consult and coordinate with each other, because they will need to work together, and they are working together increasingly with regard to these larger geostrategic issues that affect China. But at the same time, the US has national interests and relations with all of these countries, like the US-Sri Lanka relations, US-Maldives relations, and then that sometimes may not necessarily align with India's relations with Sri Lanka or India's relations with Maldives. So I think it'll be interesting to monitor both of those separate tracks.
Thanks. So Ranmali asks, Sri Lanka is highly criticized for drifting towards China, especially in the past decade. Being a small state in the Indian Ocean, can Sri Lanka truly balance both India and China when conducting its foreign policy? Do you see strategies that can be used in this regard?
It's an interesting question, because if you're thinking about international relations literature, that term balance, it has some connotations of working actively against a power like the United States or like India, for example. But I think overall you're talking about how can Sri Lanka maintain a policy of engaging all of these countries. So I think that's what you're getting at. It's just that term always, I think for people who are in international relations, you always kind of wonder, are you talking about it in theoretical terms? But actually, your question really gets to what I'm increasingly focused on these days, is really small states and small states international relations theory, and what that means in a South Asian context. So I think one way that I'm thinking about it is smaller South Asia, or SSA, is how will these countries deal with this issue of great power competition between the US and China, and then of course India's interest with regard to China. So it's really it's a topic that I think is understudied, underexamined. So I think it's an important question to be asking.
Banura asks a question: how do you see the current economic climate of small states such as Sri Lanka, Chad, Tanzania impacting US-China relations, and do you see it being an ideological or economical cold war?
I think the extent to which it could impact US-China relations are in issues of hard power issues like military basing. I think that's always the concern that is discussed, that you hear, at least from a US perspective, is Sri Lanka going to become a Chinese base, or is Tanzania going to have a Chinese base? A lot of times it comes down to those hard power, those demonstrations of hard power. And then I think taking a step back from just purely a hard power prism, then there are questions of if Tanzania conducts an economic deal with China, a big deal like a port, will that somehow lead to a military base? So I think that is at least a lot of the thinking that I've observed in some of these articles that are written about Tanzania or Sri Lanka. Certainly China's interest in Africa. What does that actually look like, the outcomes of that?
Okay. So Shantini is asking, we see a difference between Sri Lanka and Bangladesh when it comes to how they deal with their neighbor India in relations to Chinese taking a foothold in these nations. Do you think Sri Lanka is doing something detrimental to the rest of the states in the region? Is there, from a Washington perspective, do you think there's something that's going wrong here? Or?
Well, I think Australia is in a different position. Bangladesh recently was able to help Sri Lanka in terms of a currency swap. It's first ever. So Bangladesh has a surplus now of foreign exchange reserves, and that's something Sri Lanka doesn't have the luxury of having right now. So Sri Lanka is going to need to do those types of swaps with China. It's going to need loans, unfortunately, because it has an internal economic problem that it needs to to address. But I think if with these questions of larger strategic issues and strategic alignment with some of these countries, I think just issues of being or a stance of being open, or at least appearing open to outreach by India, by the United States, by European powers, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, that issue was very controversial. And I think arguably, why did it have to be controversial? Why did it have to be these types of grants? Why do they need to be politicized? I think it gets to this question of, we're talking about a larger strategic competition here, and then sometimes the manifestation are things that were not thought of in that prism are now politicized. So I think just being aware of that, and then thinking more strategically, honestly, about what the priorities are, but thinking clearly in terms of levels. Is this really at the diplomatic level? What does this mean? At the economic level, what does this mean? And then how do these interact at the strategic level?
What is your opinion on the multipolar future of the Indo-Pacific region, and how should Sri Lanka position itself accordingly?
That's a good question. I see that really the Indo-Pacific it's now, the region has now increased in terms of size. So I see there's more advanced regional architecture in the Pacific, like with ASEAN, for example. You can contrast that to Indian Ocean institutions such as the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA, or even the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, or IONS. Those are institutions that I would argue are less developed or less advanced than some institutions, like the East Asia Summit. I think Sri Lanka, though, and some of this gets back to Sri Lanka's identity as a small state, it's been very active in terms of multilateral institutions, going back to the United Nations, getting itself involved. We talked about the SEO, really participating in as many multilateral institutions as possible. Because when you think about small states in general, theoretically, that is part of the way they actually magnify or augment their power, because it is very difficult to do that alone. So one strategy is to participate in regional institutions, become members or dialogue partners of as many institutions as possible. So I think that is one way that I see Sri Lanka positioning itself.
Absolutely, because there's also the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is another amazing platform for cooperation. It brings the United States in, it brings North and South Korea in, it brings China in, it brings so many countries to the same table. That's an extension of the ASEAN. What is your view on the Vietnamese approach to the SCS issues and the Quad?
I don't study Vietnam, so I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
Okay, no problem. So next one is, do you think the Indo-Pacific region paves the way for the most powerful states to circulate together within the region itself and influence the diplomatic and foreign relations in the developing states of these regions? So I guess what Bernadette is trying to ask is there going to be added influence? Is this going to be another form of pressure being brought to bear on smaller countries, developing countries? You're going to get
Yes, I that the premise of that question, and I think we've already seen that, is through some of these economic interactions, like we talked about, Millennium Challenge Corporation, and even just some of the bilateral agreements that China has been concluding with countries in the Indo-Pacific. Those have already become politicized or conceived of in a strategic context when we're really just talking about commercial interactions or commercial dealings. So I think that's already been a consequence that we've observed as analysts, but I think we still, it's really still in progress. We need to study, are these, it's a hypothesis, are these projects that are commercial, are they taking on are they demonstrating strategic effects or strategic consequences? So I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but I think it's really an issue that's important to track, and it really varies in terms of the lifespan of each particular project.
Nilanthi, we're coming to the end of our time, but I just want to go back to your work. You influence policy, you advise on policy formulation. You're doing it as part of an institution that is very much involved with, and it's a Center for Naval Analyses, but also in the bigger picture, in the Washington context. Can you share that with us? How does policy receive inputs from research institutions, think tanks like yourself? How is that nexus overcome? How is that coalition created there? And how effective is it? Now, there's a lot of work that is being done by yourself and several others in Washington, and also several other advisors elsewhere, in terms of feeding into American policy formulation. Now, do you see that exactly being implemented? Do you see you talked about how from Trump to Biden, there's been continuity to some extent when it comes to certain issues. How is this cooperation taking place? If you could share that with us.
Yeah. Question. I mean, I would say, you know, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, so I would argue I'm not influencing policy, but I think to your question, you're really talking about that larger culture of academics speaking with each other and then interacting with policymakers. I could say in the Washington context, there's a very robust discussion that goes on through the form of many think tank events and a lot of these Zoom discussions. So you see people really learning from each other. To what extent that actually influences the policy process, though, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's a really interesting question that you could be studied, but because at least I think in US policy, there are these strategy documents that come out that like the national security strategy, where there are certain objectives, and then it kind of goes down from there in terms of each department to implement the strategy, whether it's the Department of Defense or the State Department, and then it just goes down to the lower levels to implement their pieces of it. So I think your question is interesting because it's really speaking to this question of do academics, can they influence policy? I think that's something it's an open question. I don't know if we really can know the answer, or perhaps talking to retired officials and actually trying to really pin them down. Can you actually think of a decision that you made that was directly influenced by an academic, for example? But I think in the aggregate, policymakers, they will attend some of these think tank events and they're learning, which I think is a good thing for policymakers to hear the debates that are going on. But whether they actually act on those insights from academics, I think that's an open question.
I guess you use that word debates. You need to be hearing all sides. You need to be attuned to different opinion, different perspectives. Someone's got to play devil's advocate as well, give you a different perspective so that you make a much more informed decision. And I guess that's part of decision making. So certainly. Just one last question is coming in from Savitri Nilanthi. If I could just pose that to you. In terms of the Indo-Pacific Quad, France and Britain have been showing interest in the coalition. And one could say the Quad has drawn major European countries into the region to strengthen the Quad's goal. And we're using the word balancing against China once again. What are your thoughts on this? Can we expect increased involvement of France and Britain in the region with the Quad?
It's a really interesting question. It's something I've personally been studying, just to look at essentially, these are, France and Britain are still, they're not extra regional powers. They actually do have territory in the region, but their capitals are located extra regionally. So they're in a unique position. But I think, at least if you're thinking about US policy, US national interests, France and Britain are among the United States' closest allies. So broadly, it makes sense for the US to work with its very close allies, not even just allies generally, very close allies on issues of national importance for the United States. So I think, I would imagine from a US policy maker's perspective, when they're having to think about what are the assets and the relationships that they have in the region, I see France and Britain as really helping to advance those US interests.
Thank you so much, Nilanthi. Thank you very much for your thoughts, for reflecting, for responding to the different views that were expressed. And I guess, as you said, and as I agree with you 100%, we need to have platforms on which we are going to be able to exchange opinions, exchange ideas, become that much more informed, that much more aware. Whether it be at the decision-making level or people at the grassroots, we need to be so much more aware of what is going on around us. And you did an amazing job there in articulating positions, talking about the concept, giving us the background to it, talking about policy formulation within the US structure, but also looking at Sri Lanka and going beyond that. We talked about the impact on Sri Lanka, but certainly we went beyond that into looking at the Pacific. We looked at the ASEAN region, even the SCO and areas such as that. So thank you once again, Nilanthi, for taking time. It's the start of your day. You're going to have a longer day today because of us. Thank you so much for giving us of your time. And thank you to everyone who participated, who was a part of this discussion. The Awarelogue initiative wants to promote much more engagement of this nature and dialogue of this nature. So thank you so much for your very thought-provoking questions that came in. Because we centered a lot around India. India came up a lot, and what we're going to focus on next month is we're going to be talking about India-Sri Lanka relations during the Rajiv Gandhi Premiership. This is a very interesting time because we're 30 years after his passing. His assassination took place in 1991. So we're going to use that occasion to reflect upon foreign policy that was formulated. We have Professor Karori Singh, who will be speaking to us. This will be on the 13th of August. And this is one of the many events that we have planned up for the month ahead in the month of August. So thank you once again for being a part of this Awarelogue initiative program, the Awarelogue Lecture Forum. Thank you, Nilanthi, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you, George.